All right, students, this is Professor Gore. This is the last recorded lecture for U.S. History 1, and this is at the very end of Module 4. And so this is kind of the second half of Reconstruction. So the previous lecture, we had talked about Andrew Johnson becoming president after Lincoln's assassination, and not a very successful president, vetoed several pieces of legislation passed by Republican majority Congress. And the Republican Party, you had some radical ones in the sense that they were radical in the sense that they wanted to forever change the fabric of the South. They wanted to prevent high-ranking Confederate officials from ever voting again. They also wanted to rebuild the Southern economy by producing more industry instead of this one cash crop economy with cotton, build more railroads, and kind of prevent the racial discrimination that the Southerners were enacting against African Americans. They want to provide African Americans education, voting rights, citizenship, also land. And many of these things are not going to be able to be accomplished. In this part of the lecture, we're going to discover why that is the case. So Johnson really doesn't even get the Democratic nomination. Horatio Seymour gets the Democratic nomination, election of 1868. And then he's running against a war hero. And typically in American history, when a war hero runs, unless you're Winfield Scott, you're going to win. And so Grant, who was kind of this legendary general who, well, I wouldn't say legendary, but famous general who had defeated Robert E. Lee in 1864 and early 1865 to help the Army of the Potomac win in the Eastern Theater of the American Civil War. He ran for office and is going to get elected by winning 214 out of the 294 electoral votes. And so Grant, kind of an interesting president. He definitely doesn't go down as one of our best American presidents by any stretch of the imagination. Was a little bit gullible, appointed different people in his cabinet, including some family members, via marriage. And he is going to have a few corrupt scandals that take place during his administration. He wasn't personally involved in them, but because he appointed the individuals that were responsible and kind of aloof to what was going on, he is going to be blamed. And really, Congress could kind of do whatever they wanted to a certain extent with Grant in office. In fact, they almost ran him for a third term just so they could continue that trend. So Grant, he is going to serve a two-term presidency. And one of the things that you're going to see as well is, Grant was seen somewhat as a hero, not only for the war, but also from kind of standing up to Johnson that led to the impeachment process and so forth. And one of the things that as soon as he comes in office, the third important amendment that gets passed during Reconstruction is going to get passed. It's called the 15th Amendment. So remember, free man vote. 13th is freedom. 14th is citizenship. You're going to make them considered a man, a citizen in the country. And the 15th Amendment is the right to vote for adult African-American men. So you could not discriminate voting based on somebody's race. Now, we're going to find out that the Jim Crow South, you are going to have discriminations that were put in place at local and state level, not the federal level. And because the federal government did not enforce in a lot of these areas, you're going to have this discrimination that takes place that's going to be kind of infamous in American history. So the problem is, the amendment left room for poll taxes, as well as property requirements or literacy tests that might be used to discourage blacks from voting. And so one of the things that happens is in the South, some of the more elite are going to pass local laws that made it where you had to pay a tax in order to vote. Well, that discriminated against poor blacks and whites from voting in the South. Not every state had it, but a lot of southern states did. They also try to pass where you had to, some states and some local areas where you had to own property in order to vote. So if you were a sharecropper, either black or white, that would prevent you from voting. They also, some areas even enacted literacy tests. You had to be able to read and write in order to vote. There's a couple others that you're going to see passed in the South that are discriminatory I think the most infamous one is the grandfather clause. And so this was passed, it wasn't passed everywhere in the South, but it passed in some areas where, particularly like some places of Mississippi and Alabama, but you're going to see where in order to vote, your grandfather had to vote. Now, this was passed to allow poor whites to vote, but discriminate against poor blacks or just blacks in general, because before the 15th Amendment was passed, African Americans were denied the right to vote in the South, whether you were free or slave. And so the grandfather clause made it where if your grandfather didn't vote, then you're not going to vote. So you're not going to have voting for generations where the grandfather clause is enacted. Okay. And so these were discriminatory laws put in place at the local and state level to prevent African Americans, in some cases poor whites, from voting as well. So really, it is passed in 1868, 1869. It's not enacted until the last Southern state passed it in 1870. Okay. So this is the 15th Amendment. This is a quote from the actual amendment. And so here are the 5 military districts that you're going to see the Reconstruction Act of 1867 enact. So Texas and Louisiana is district number 5. Arkansas, Mississippi, district number 4. Tennessee is actually brought into the Union, not part of one of these military districts. That's Andrew Johnson taking care of his home state, because Tennessee should have been part of one of the military districts. Virginia, which is where a lot of the war was fought in, was military district number 1. North Carolina, South Carolina, number 2. And Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, which Florida doesn't have a huge population at this time, is military district number 3. And so Tennessee brought back in the Union the earliest, even though it was very much a Confederate state. Okay. Now, one group that is denied the right to vote, and so you see that women are denied the right to vote at the Constitutional Convention. Really, if the United States would have passed women, given women the right to vote in the 1780s, it would have, not only what they were doing government-wise was revolutionary in the world, it would have been extremely revolutionary. But by 1860, it still would have been revolutionary for the United States to grant women the right to vote. But you start seeing in some of the European countries, particularly in the early 1900s, so you're about 50 years away from women getting the right to vote in a lot of countries. Now, one of the reasons why you see women getting the right to vote in the early 20th century is because of women's efforts in World War I. And we'll cover that in one of the kind of the second module during U.S. history too. But women were denied the right to vote, and you remember, women were the women's rights movement began during the Second Great Awakening, and a lot of the women's rights activists were abolitionists. So they pushed for abolition along with women have the right to vote. And so when that was denied in the 15th Amendment, because all you needed in the 15th and 14th Amendment is add the word that going to discriminate based on gender along with race, and that one simple word would have given women not only citizenship in the 14th Amendment, but also the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. And so that's not passed until way later when we get to the 19th Amendment in the 1910s. And so a lot of these abolitionist women are livid. And some of them, you can see some of their prejudice or racism come out because they're very discriminatory, not very discriminatory, I should say, but very critical of African-American men getting the right to vote and women not getting the right to vote. Particularly, they were educated in the North. They thought that they would have a greater sense of what's going on than an illiterate adult African-American male in the South. So you kind of see this prejudice come out in anger and so forth. And also African-American abolitionists and women's rights advocates such as Sojourner Truth was angered as well. And this 15th Amendment actually ends up splitting the women's rights movement. And so Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe led the majority to form the American Woman Suffrage Association, who aligned themselves with the Republican Party. These female moderates hoped that the Reconstruction women would receive the vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Anthony, a little more radical, they were based out of New York. They formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. They only accepted women and focused exclusively on women's rights and resolutely took up the battle for federal women's suffrage. So the American Women's Suffrage Association, a little more moderate, aligned themselves with the Republican Party, is hoping that Reconstruction will lead to having the right to vote. They're definitely wanting suffrage. But the American Women's Suffrage Association is going to try to push for women having the right to vote at the local and state level. And there's going to be some Western states that are going to accomplish that well before the 19th Amendment. And then the National Women's Suffrage Association, more the radical group, is going to focus on suffrage at the national level. And like Susan B. Anthony gets arrested and goes to trial for trying to vote, even though she was not a man, and so forth. And so American Women's Suffrage Association, the women, the women's rights activists who were men would have joined that one. The National Women's Suffrage Association would have prevented men from joining. So the top one, more moderate, the bottom one, more radical, if that helps you remember that. Okay, so the one of the things that's going to take place under the Grant administration during Reconstruction is that you're going to see kind of white supremacy take back over in the South. And so it doesn't mean that every white person in the South was, pushing for white rule and so forth, because you have groups in the South that were different. Now, the majority were typically Southern white Democrats, but you also had Southern white Republicans. They were the minority. A lot of them held power during this time. And then you also had African Americans who primarily voted Republican. Actually, just about all of them voted Republican just because the Southern Democrats would not have supported them in the least. And so between 1868 and 1871, all the Southern states met the congressional stipulations and rejoined the Union. Basically, they were doing what they had to do to get back into the Union. Protected by federal troops, state Republican organizations took hold across the South. The Reconstruction administrations they set up remained in power for periods ranging from a few months in Virginia to 9 years in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Their core support came from African Americans, who constitute a majority of registered voters in Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, Mississippi. Now, there's two groups I want you to take notes on so you can distinguish between the two, because the Ku Klux Klan is going to go after three different groups in the South. Carpetbaggers were whites who were from the North who moved to the South. Some of them had served in the Union Army, liked the climate and served dealing with the winters of the North. Can't say I blame them there. And wanted to try to make a name for themselves financially and so forth in the South. Some of them are just going to move from the North to the South, hoping to capitalize on economic gains at that time. The other group that were white were called scallywags. These are Southern white Republicans. Scallywag was not a positive term. And then African Americans. So those are the groups that the Ku Klux Klan is going to attack. So you do have free blacks that were living in the North that also moved to the South to take leadership roles in local, state, and federal government. Blanche Bruce, so I'll show you a picture of him in just a minute. He was the second black senator from Mississippi. And what's interesting is he actually took the former Senate seat that Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederacy, actually held. If that doesn't show irony in history, what does? So a lot of these guys have been preachers. And so ministers are going to play a very important role in the social fabric of African-American communities. And many of them are going to serve during radical Reconstruction. Now, eventually they're going to be forced out of office by being voted out when the Southern white Democrats eventually take back over. Some carpetbaggers that come, like I mentioned, are motivated by profit, though some brought capital and skills with them, so money and particular trade skills. Others were Union Army veterans who liked the South's climate, people, and economic opportunities. Scallywags were former slave owners, ex-Whigs, and even ex-Democrats drawn to republicanism as the best way to attract northern capital, southern railroads, mines, and factories. Some of the scallywags were hoping to profit economically from that. But most were Yawan farmers from the backcountry districts who wanted to rid the South of its slaveholding aristocracy. So you do have a lot of poor whites that were scallywags because they're hoping to get rid of the planter elite and so forth. And a lot of them, particularly from mountainous areas of the South who didn't have much slavery, had not fought or supported the Confederacy. Since the majority of Southerners did support the Confederacy, they were in the minority. And so I mentioned Blanche Bruce. As the reconstructed Republican governments of 1867 began to function, this diverse group of ministers, artisans, shopkeepers, and former soldiers reached out to the freedmen. African-American speakers, some financed by the Republican Party, fanned out into the old plantation districts and recruited ex-slaves for political roles. Most have been preachers or artisans, with only a few being former field hands. In South Carolina, African-Americans constitute a majority in the lower house of the legislature in 1868 because they made up the majority of the population. 3 were elected to Congress. Another joined the state Supreme Court. Over the entire course of Reconstruction, 20 African Americans served in state administrations as governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, treasurer, or superintendent of education. More than 600 served as state legislatures, and 16 were U.S. congressmen. We're going to see that change by the end of Reconstruction, unfortunately. So the Republicans wanted to end the South's dependence, as I mentioned, on that cotton crop, cash crop economy. And they wanted them to be more like the North in terms of economic progress and so forth. Now, this right here is a picture of African Americans that served in Congress. And you can see Harriam Revels was on the left, and then Blanche Bruce was right beside him, and so forth. Actually, I think I said Blanche Bruce filled the gap of held by Jefferson Davis. It was actually Harriam Revels. Here he is right here on the left, and there's Blanche Bruce on the right. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, they want to, the Republican Congress wants to kind of reshape the Southern economy and so forth. Republican social programs call for the establishment of hospitals. That's a good thing. More humane penitentiaries. Okay, so that's prison and insane asylum reform for the Second Great Awakening. And also asylums for orphans and the mentally ill. So that's that insane asylum reform. Money poured into road building projects and the region's shattered railroad network. They paid for it by introducing property taxes on both real estate and personal wealth. Problem is, and this is what's going to play into the Southern Democrats being able to take power, is the South was already kind of broke from the Civil War, and then they increased property taxes. So that angered a lot of people because they really had a tough time putting food on the table. And then secondly, the states had enacted all this debt, and then these Republican Congresses and the state legislature enacted debt, and that is going to anger a lot of people. So higher tax revenues could not make up for the budget shortfalls as many state governments fell into debt. Public credit collapsed. Much spending was wasted or ended up in the pockets of public officials. So you did have some government corruption, and that really hurt. Now, in terms of schools and churches being established, only Tennessee had a system of public schooling in the South before the Civil War. So Tennessee had really the only tax-funded public education system in the Southern Confederacy. Republicans sought to establish schools throughout the South, which, as an educator, I personally love. African Americans of all ages rushed to the newly established schools. So, like I mentioned about schools being established by the Freedmen's Bureau in like Palm Bluff, Arkansas. The early schools for blacks were mostly taught by white missionaries from the North. And after the war, blacks also built and started their own church congregations. So one of the things you see is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This is a predominantly African American domination. And then also the National Baptist Convention was a predominantly Baptist African American denomination as well. They formed schools, social centers, political meeting halls. Black clerics were community leaders and often political leaders as well. Black ministers provided a powerful religious underpinning for the Republican Party of their congregations. Okay. Now you can see right here, cities are going to be rebuilt like Atlanta, and Atlanta is eventually going to become prosperous as time goes along. Over 1,000 schools were built. Hospitals, 45 in 14 different states, and diversify their economy. You can see the railroads that are built. Also, textile industry began coming to the South. Now, let me explain why textile mills moved from New England states to the South. Before that, slave labor had made cotton so affordable, it didn't matter if you paid for the shipping on railroads to those New England factories. Now, with slavery gone, cotton prices are going to go up. And so the South is so economically poor, the textile owners decide, what if we moved these mills to New England down to the South? We can pay those workers crappy wages because they're desperate for work and they'll work it, and then they'll make clothing. And so that's why you start seeing textile mills coming to the South, because you can pay them crappy wages and so forth. All right, so a lot of infrastructure projects are trying to be built. Infrastructure is always great in American history. The problem is you got to be able to pay for it, and the South didn't have a way to pay for it. And then you had some government corruption and some other things, and then there's going to be some debt. And so the heavy taxes was not very popular. And across the South, you had about $130 million in Southern debt. So the Freedmen's Bureau One of the things, as I mentioned, is education is their most famous thing during Reconstruction. Um, and really, a lot of the Southern um, Democratic elite at that time just really hated the idea of blacks getting education. Now, scallywags didn't necessarily have a problem with it. Carpetbaggers didn't have a problem with it, but the kind of the white Southern Democratic elite are the ones going to have a lot of an issue with them getting an education. And so this is a quote from a Freedmen's Bureau teacher that came from the North. I think it's pretty cool. And notice that they actually had to pay to go to school, and their parents found a way to pay for it, which I think is impressive for that day and age when how little money they had. But here's a quote from her. She says, "It's surprising to me to see the amount of suffering which many of the people endure for the sake of sending their children to school. Men get very low wages here, from $2.50 to $8 a month usually, while a first-rate hand may get $10 and a peck or two of meal per week for rations. And a great many men cannot get work at all. The women taking sewing and washing go out by day to sour, etc. There's one woman who supports 3 children and keeps them at school. She says, I don't care how hard I have to work. If I can only send Sally and the boys to to school looking respectable." And so here's a Freedmen's Bureau teacher. You can look how humble the classrooms were. Now, you had students of a variety of ages all in the same classroom. This is actually a nicer classroom in a southern city. You can see Lincoln and George Washington's portrait in the back. And so these are African American colleges that are founded. You can look, they're almost all of them, except for Spelman and North Carolina A&T and Tuskegee Institute, are primarily going to be founded during Reconstruction, which is kind of cool. Now, I've already kind of gone over sharecropping, but a majority of African Americans that obtain work after the Civil War are going to get it in sharecropping. And so this is where you enter a contractual agreement. You work somebody else's land. You give the majority of your crops at the end of the harvest season to the owner of the land. And because you had to go into debt to get the seed, the tools, the clothing, the housing that you're living on, you were supposed to, over time, try to pay that off. At times, depending on what kind of contract you entered into, you were able to do that. Other times, you were not. The freedmen hoped to get 40 acres that they were originally told by the Union Army that they were going to receive. That is not able to be accomplished. Okay. As I mentioned, there were poor white tenant farmers that did this as well. This is an example of a sharecropper shack. Okay. You can see it's a very humble place to live. These are pictures of sharecroppers in the late 1800s. This is actually a nicer sharecropper housing. The fact that it's got those wooden board roofs shows it's a little bit nicer. This is weighing a big cotton bale. Okay. Now, the advantages of it was, for one thing, you go from owning nothing and having no income to at least getting some. And you got to keep about a third to half of the crop harvested. So if you're harvesting cotton, then you can sell that. And it did give their social status raised from slavery to at least a tenant farmer. Disadvantages, though: blacks stay in the South instead of going to better economic opportunities in the Midwest and the Northeast in factories. Or, some with exodusters go out west to take advantage of the Homestead Act, but really more of them could have taken advantage of the Homestead Act. Okay, it's basically economic slavery. So if you can look right here, it's kind of the cycle of sharecropping and economic slavery. And really, you start seeing more and more sharecroppers leaving their sharecropping arrangements during and right after World War I and during and right after World War II, particularly when the mechanical cotton picker came out right after World War II. You see a tremendous flood going in northern cities because of better economic opportunities. Okay. And a lot of times the Freedmen's Bureau was the mediator in between African Americans and these former slave owners. And so you can see the percentage of sharecroppers. The higher percentage of sharecroppers typically were where the highest concentrations of slavery existed. And areas that had 0 to 20%, those had typically the greatest population of Yeoman farmers. Not always. So I've already talked about exodusters in the first or during the Civil War lecture, but these are blacks who tried to move to Kansas, take advantage of the Homestead Act. Now, unfortunately, the undoing of Reconstruction is actually going to take place. This happens towards in the 1870s, and so these are called and historians call them redeemers, since they're trying to redeem that old planter dominated South. Okay, so these planters were ex-Confederates, and they staged a massive counter-revolution, and they really restored Southern Democrats to power, and Southern Democrats can remain in power in the South for decades. So Southern Democrats worked hard to get ex-Confederates restored to the voting rolls. They appealed to Southern patriotism, and they campaigned against black rule. Throughout the Deep South, especially where black voters were heavily concentrated, ex-Confederate planters and their supporters organized secretly and terrorized blacks and their white allies. Okay, now let's talk about one of the most infamous groups in American history, and that is the Ku Klux Klan. And so the Klan was started by ruthless yet the best-known Confederate cavalry officer, Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. He participated in the Fort Pillow massacre in Tennessee, where they slaughtered black troops. The first Klan den started in Pulaski, Tennessee, in late 1865 or early 1866. We're not exactly sure. They seemed identical to Democratic clubs at first. So you had some Democratic clubs that weren't like this, but and so when they kind of arose originally, it was kind of fooling a little bit. The Klan unleashed a murderous campaign of terror against Republican sympathizers, and the Republicans in the state backed down. The governor, William Brownlow, ran for the Senate instead of cracking down with the state militias. So instead of in Tennessee, him cracking it down, he's like, screw this, I'm just going to run for the U.S. Senate. Elsewhere, the Klan raged on, murdering Republican politicians, burning black schools and churches, and attacking party gatherings, with more or less the same results in Tennessee. And by 1870, Democrats had seized power in Georgia and North Carolina and were making headway across the South. Now, one of the things that you're going to see, I want to show you some of this picture in the top left is actually from the Klan rally in the 1920s. So this is a Klan initiation meeting. Now, their uniforms looked a lot more sophisticated, and they all look ridiculous, really. But in the 1920s, so they were too poor to afford nice uniforms in the 1860s and 1870s. They really just were probably like a sack over their head with the eye holes put in, and so forth. So they wanted to really keep African Americans in a submissive role. And how the federal government responds is they passed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Now, you know you're bad when the federal government has a act specifically passed against you with your name in it. And it was designed to enforce the rights of ex-slaves under the 14th and 15th Amendments. The so-called enforcement laws authorized federal prosecutions, military interventions, and martial law to suppress terrorist activities that deprive citizens of their civil and political rights. In South Carolina, where the Klan became most deeply entrenched, federal troops occupied 9 counties, made hundreds of arrests, and drove as many as 2,000 Klansmen from the state. Northern Republicans grew tired of the violence and prosecutors facing all-white juries. Because oftentimes, when you had all-white juries, they would just acquit the person that was accused of crime. Now, I'm not sure how every state cracked down, but I think it's fascinating how Arkansas was able to crack down. They actually use undercover police work, which I think is pretty fascinating, because undercover police work has been very effective throughout, at least the last 150 years or so, in police work to bring criminals to justice. Now, the first undercover agents were actually done by the Pinkerton Agency to bring down this kind of Irish terrorist group called the Molly Maguires at one point, and they would blow up mines and try to blow up mine owners and so forth in the mines. And they infiltrated the Irish Molly Maguires by using undercover police work. So how the Arkansas National Guard, which they called the Arkansas State Militia at that time, cracked down on the Ku Klux Klan in Arkansas was they had these guys that were hired by the state, and they went in and said they wanted to join the Klan. They were really undercover agents, and they were discovered where their Klan dens were, and then the state militia or the National Guard would come in and then eliminate it and attack the Klan members and so forth. And it was very effective. It helps kind of suppress the Klan in Arkansas. Now, the North often received kind of one-sided media reports of black barbarism and other things. They weren't getting the true story, and Southerners in Congress wanted that. Charles Sumner tried to get the Civil Rights Bill passed in 1870 that would have protected African Americans from discriminatory treatment by guaranteeing them equal access to public accommodation, schools, and jury service. So this would have eliminated Jim Crow South. But by the time the bill gets passed in 1875, it had been stripped of its key provisions. And so when it gets passed, it's really watered down, worthless. Then in 1883, the Supreme Court declared it even unconstitutional. Men like Roscoe Conkling of New York became prominent in the Republican Party. He and his supporters could care less about Reconstruction unless it benefited the Republican Party. When we're going to talk about in the first module of U.S. History 2, we talk about politics of the Gilded Age, we'll talk about the Roscoe Conkling and his group of Republicans. And so you kind of have these stalwarts and so forth, and then the mugwumps of the Republican Party. And so Roscoe Conkling was the most well-known and prominent stalwart who wanted to kind of keep on with the status quo and anything that benefited them. Now, as the party lost headway in the South, Republicans lost interest in the battle for black rights. President Grant turned the cheek to this, especially when corruption came within his own cabinet. So corruption kind of really distracted him from actually doing the right thing in the South. Many Republicans became concerned with the idea of free labor that had America as a land of self-reliant, industrious property owners. Some Republicans pushed for a national labor union and pushed for 8-hour workdays. That collapsed in 1872. Republicans also became concerned with eliminating government corruption by focusing on civil service reform. That was a very important task to take up because you did have nepotism and government corruption that needed to be reformed. The problem is that that became the main focus as opposed to helping African Americans accomplish their rights in the South. They called themselves liberals and believed in free trade, market competition, and limited government. Now, one of the things I always tell students is that a lot of times they try to compare the Republican Democratic parties in the latter half of the 1800s to the Republicans Democrats today. You can't really do that. The reason why is the issues were completely different. Like only just in the last 2 years have tariffs become a political issue again, but tariffs were a huge political issue in the late 1800s, and that was a battleground. And really, at the national level, besides dealing with the South, the Democratic Republicans didn't differ a whole lot, and the issues were like civil service reform. Like that's not an issue in the 20th century. You start seeing the modern Republican and Democratic parties emerging right after World War I, with the 1920s, 1930s. That's where you start seeing more of the modern emergence of that. Now, let's look at Grant's reelection and the election of 1872. Now, this is an interesting political cartoon because this is actually painted by a Northerner. And just notice how they portray the Southerners as kind of like this country redneck, and then they portray the African Americans as like poor and helpless, and they're pointing them by gunpoint, making them vote for who they tell them to vote for. Okay, so this is a famous political cartoon in American history. Here's another one: Union soldier trying to protect a freedman, and the Confederate or ex-Confederate is harassing them. And this is one of the things you'll see right here on the left is they portray the Irish on the left as kind of suppressing the African American and so forth. And this is another one where a child's been killed, and then a Southerner's claim, "Oh, that was in self-defense." Okay, because you had a lot of lynchings that took place as well. Let me explain what a lynching actually is. Now, lynching is one of the dark spots in American history, and lynchings occurred against black and whites, actually not just in the South but across the U.S. Between 1880 and 1920 was actually the greatest rates of racial violence that we have on record. Now, chances are in the slavery time period it may have been worse, but you got to realize that slaves were viewed as property. They didn't want to kill their property. But between 1880 and 1920 is the greatest time periods of racial violence in American history, statistically, I should say. Now, lynching is where somebody is either committed a crime or they were accused of a crime but didn't really commit it, or they just didn't like somebody, and then you want to have like this mob murder. What they would do is instead of having them, let's say somebody was accused of murder, instead of them going to having their due process and go to a court of law, tried by jury, their peers, for a chance to acquit or convict them of their crime, You would have these mobs who would storms on the jail or grab somebody out of their home. And you would have these big public spectacles where they would take somebody, particularly in the South, a lot of African Americans, but this happened against whites as well, but primarily African Americans. But you see this happen in the Pacific Northwest, Minnesota even, lynchings occurred. And so they would take somebody out and publicly hang them. They might burn them alive. There was even one during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency where they burned somebody on a log in Delaware, of all places, and so forth. And it's really just terrible, these lynchings. There was one that was south of Atlanta where they ran a special rail line for people from Atlanta to go witness it. It is horrible. And so forth, what transpires. And so for a while, you're going to see leaders such as Ida B. Wells. Sometimes she's called Ida Wells Barnett. But Ida B. Wells would campaign for a federal anti-lynching law. FDR, his wife, supported it, but he ended up not, because he needed Southern Democratic congressmen to vote for New Deal programs. And that was kind of a thing that he was criticized for in his presidency. This is a letter about the Ku Klux Klan. I think it's interesting. And this is from Mississippi. This is writing to their sister. I will endeavor to answer your joyfully received letter. I must tell you something about the Ku Klux. They are raging on the other side of the river. They have whipped several white men, whipped and killed several Negroes. They whipped Colonel Huggins, the superintendent of the free schools, nearly to death, and everybody rejoiced when they heard it, for everybody hated him. He squandered the public money buying pianofortes, organs, sofas, and furniture for the Negro schoolhouse in Aberdeen. You can tell her prejudice in this. The people are attacked beyond endurance. The Ku Klux gave him 70 lashes and then gave him 10 days to leave the country. He left and went to Jackson. There was a regiment of militia came into Aberdeen Friday. They were sent here to put down the Ku Klux. Huggins has come back with the militia, but I wouldn't give him a straw for his life, or he will be killed. It is opinion amongst everybody there will be war. The Yankees coming here will make the Negroes more insolent. With a country full of Yankees, things are going too far. For the free whites of the South are determined not to put up with it. A Negro can kill a white man, take it in court, get a Negro jury, clear him, and then turn him loose. Things can't go on this way. We're in a most peculiar situation. Now, it's interesting, her quote right there about the jury. When usually the opposite occur, you would have a white person commit a crime and have an all-white jury, and then they would be acquitted. Give my love to all the connections, and write soon. Yours, Jeannie. Anyway, so this is an interesting quote. This is a heartfelt. This is actually in Kentucky, a state that didn't break away from the Union. That we believe you are not familiar with the description of the Ku Klux Klans riding nightly over the country, going from county to county, and the county town, spreading terror wherever they go by robbing, whipping, ravishing, and killing our people without provocation. Ravishing is rape, by the way. Compelling colored people to break the ice and bathe in the chilly waters of the Kentucky River. The state legislature has adjourned. They refuse to enact any laws to suppress Ku Klux disorder. The Ku Klux Klan are now being licensed to continue their dark and bloody deeds under the cover of the dark night. Okay, they don't attack usually in daytime. They refuse to allow us to testify in the state courts where a white man is concerned. We find their deeds are perpetrated only upon colored men and white Republicans. We also find that for our services to the government and our race, we have become the special object of hatred and persecution at the hands of the Democratic Party. Our people are driven from their homes in great numbers, having no redress only except the United States courts, which is in many cases unable to reach them. So this is the Ku Klux Klan Act I've already covered. And Fort's Act was designed to enforce federal laws. The Civil Rights Bill of 1870, remember I told you, it gets stripped of its main provisions. It gets passed in 1875. Would have been great if it had been gone into law and then later gets declared unconstitutional. So unfortunate. Election of 1872, Grant faces off against a Northern Democrat. Actually, Horace Greeley was considered a reformer, and he was nominated by liberal Republicans and Democrats. So liberal Republicans even voted for Horace Greeley because he was kind of considered as a moral reformer and as governor, or well, he was editor of New York Tribune and so forth. Liberal Republicans try to start their own party. These are kind of more radical Republicans, but they lost. Grant won every electoral vote and 56% of the popular votes. Now, that's one of the biggest, probably maybe the biggest electoral college elections since Washington and James Monroe. And so one of the things that the Democrats began focusing on is kind of ignoring what's going on in the South, at least Northern Democrats, began pushing for civil service reform, which need to happen, a more limited government and reconciliation with the South. Okay, they're trying to bring an end to this violence. So here's Grant on the left and Horace Greeley on the right. Now, one of the things that takes place is this scandal. There's a couple of different scandals that take place. One of them is the whiskey ring. Happens in 1875, and it was a network of liquor distillers and treasury agents who defraud the government of millions of dollars in excise tax on whiskey. Now, if you remember, there was an excise tax on whiskey passed in the 1890s by Alexander Hamilton in Congress. Jefferson reduced it, but wasn't able to get rid of it. And really, alcohol tax was one of the main revenue sources for the U.S. government. Tariffs was the biggest, but whiskey tax was another one. And so what happened is these government officials under the Grant administration had issued exceptions or exemptions from the whiskey tax to these local liquor distillers who were buddies with them. Usually they were bribed them. And so that is a scandal. Grant's own private secretary, Orville Babcock, was the leader of it. The rest of the ring went to jail, but Grant bailed out Babcock. He gave him a presidential pardon. In 1873, a financial panic struck that was triggered by bankruptcy of the Northern Pacific Railroad and its main investor, Jay Cooke. Republicans faced blame for this, with many investors losing their money. Among the casualties of the bad economy was the Freeman Savings and Trust Company, which held the small deposits of thousands of ex-slaves. It was terrible. When the bank failed in 1874, Congress refused to compensate the depositors, and many lost their life savings. This signaled a shift in politics during the Gilded Age, where the government did not get involved. And the government entered what's called a laissez-faire, hands-off time period. It's a French phrase that means let it be or let it do. And so basically the government is not going to have a hands-on approach to the economy. That's going to change later in the 20th century. But at this point, from during Reconstruction, 1870s, until really the Progressive era with with Teddy Roosevelt, and you're going to have laissez-faire. And then it's going to go back to laissez-faire in the 1920s and then go back to more government hands-on with FDR and the Great Depression. And so let me explain what the Panic of 1873 is. Really, we cover it in the first module of U.S. History 2. I'm going to cover it briefly. It really is because of overbuilding of railroads. They became kind of a railroad bubble that burst. And one of the things that happened was the Credit Mobier scandal. And what that was another scandal that took place under the Grant administration. Credit Mobier was a investment, kind of a banking thing for railroads. And one of the things that was happening is they were part of this Union Pacific Railroad that was building the Transcontinental Railroad going west from Omaha, and then you had the Central Pacific that was building east from Sacramento, going through the Sierra Nevadas. And what they were doing is they were basically it was kind of like a checkered thing that every 5-acre plot, every other one, the railroad company would be given that by the federal government. They could turn around and sell it, and that's how they paid for the funding or paid for the building of the railroad. So the federal government didn't give them the money to build it. They basically gave them the land, and then they would sell the land in order to pay for it. Well, one of the things that was happening is the railroad was starting to build curves in the landscape in the railroad, so that way it would make it longer than what was necessary, so they could get more land. And then you had the Credit Mobier scandal that took place as well. And so Congress was involved, and it was really a bad deal. And so when it broke national news, the Credit Mobier kind of goes bankrupt. And anyway, it was a big scandal. And so Grant's administration with the whiskey ring and the Credit Mobier scandal was looked as scandalous. So Republicans are going to abandon Grant because his legacy was tainted there. And they go with kind of a safe candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. And Rutherford Hayes is actually a good dude in history. He was governor of Ohio, and he runs against Samuel Tilden, who was a popular Democratic candidate. And Tilden was a governor of New York. So you had two different Democratic guys from New York. You had Horace Greeley in election of 1872, and then Samuel Tilden in 1876. And he was a wealthy lawyer with ties to Wall Street, and also a reform reputation for his role in cleaning up New York City politics. So he had kind of an impressive resume. Both candidates favored home rule for the South and did not focus on Reconstruction. Reason being is the Northern part of the country is ready to just move on from the South. Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana still had governments controlled by Reconstruction. Now, here's where things get crazy. Tilden led in the popular vote and had taken key northern states, okay, because of Grant's scandals. When Republicans realized they were going to lose, they turned in electoral votes from 3 southern states that lay in the hands of Reconstruction governments, claiming Democratic fraud and intimidation. So really, this election, Tilden technically won. Now, a couple of things that happened that were corrupt on both sides of the political aisle. The Republicans are reporting that the Democrats squandered the election in these 3 southern states and that they actually won in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Now, the Democrats in the South were also being corrupt in the sense that they would pass these local discriminations that would prevent African Americans from voting. So you didn't have an accurate voting return because African Americans were denied the right to vote by the grandfather clause, property test, poll tax, those types of things. So both sides committed political dishonesty here. And what happens is both sides claim that they won. The Democrats claim they won those 3 states. And the Republicans had to win those 3 states in order to win the election. So what ends up happening is things get in an uproar in Congress when they met in early 1877. General William Tecumseh Sherman deployed 4 artillery companies in Washington just to make sure there wasn't a coup or a riot. And so what happens is Congress is going to try to work out a compromise. And this is called the Compromise of 1877. You want to take notes on it, star it, underline it, whatever you need to do to remember it. But basically, the goal is to appoint 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 deciding member who was a member of the Supreme Court named David Davis, who really was kind of an independent, didn't have a Republican or Democratic lean to him. So behind closed doors, they worked on trying to have a compromise here. And what happened is Davis disqualified himself by accepting an Illinois seat in the Senate. Okay, so he basically couldn't serve on it because he was going to go serve as a senator from Illinois. So he was replaced by Republican Justice Joseph B. Bradley. And so we don't actually know what was agreed upon behind closed doors, but we can assume because the vote was, there was 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats. And so the Republicans outnumbered the Democrats. They voted that Rutherford B. Hayes would be the next president. Okay. So we don't have any crazy violence that takes place in March of 1877, thankfully. But this is what we can assume, and what most historians have assumed today, is that they basically work out at a compromise is that if Hayes was president, then he would effectively pull out the last 3 military governments of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, and thereby Reconstruction would end. Well, in March of 1877, Hayes is inaugurated. There's no controversy, okay, after there had been quite a bit. And then all of a sudden, those last 3 Reconstruction governments are removed, and the Union forces are evacuated, and Reconstruction effectively ends. So it is safe to assume they worked out a compromise behind closed doors that if the Republicans would get the presidency, they would end Reconstruction. And so that is what is assumed actually happened behind closed doors. And so this is where you're going to see Jim Crow laws take place in the South, and it's going to last until the Civil Rights Movement. You can see right here, we don't really know how many popular votes was Tilden actually. Well, you can see it down here at the bottom. It was blocked. I'm sorry for my view, but actually Tilden won the popular vote. All right, so let's go over the Jim Crow South. And so Jim Crow laws, the name comes from the play Jumping Jim Crow, which was a minstrel show, popular theatrical performance that would kind of make fun of Irish and African Americans and Germans, among other groups. And basically, these are voting discriminations or disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South. So the most popular one was poll tax. You had to pay to vote. 24th Amendment is going to get rid of that. Literacy tests. Okay, the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is going to get rid of that in second half of U.S. history. The grandfather clause also removed in the Voting Rights Act of 1865. So this is an advertisement for the play Jumping Jim Crow. And so you see stuff like this. You began having separate accommodations. So you'd have white facilities and what they called colored facilities, which are for African Americans. Now, the term colored was used in the U.S. Census really until, midway through the 20th century, that was just a term for African Americans. So you would have whites only water fountains, black only water fountains, black entrances to movies. And usually the balcony they would sit in was never been cleaned. It was disgusting and so forth. You would have separate accommodation on railroads, later buses in American history, and you'll see the famous Rosa Parks arrest that leads to the Montgomery bus boycott, which propels Dr. King to national status and so forth. And so you can see right here at the top right, you even see Mexicans. So discriminated against in Texas and some of the southwest part of the United States against Latin Americans that had come to the U.S. And so Jim Crow laws are kind of one of the moments that the United States is certainly not proud of. And it is a big deal when the civil rights movement takes it head on in the 1950s, 1960s. You can look right here, African Americans elected to the U.S. Congress. So in the 1870s, you had the highest number. 1880s, it drops off quite a bit. 1890s, it is a little bit higher. But then 1900s, 1910s, you have hardly any. You see that is a period of racial discrimination. And then you see the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then boom, the civil rights movement happens. Okay, and you look at the number of African Americans elected to Congress in the 1990s, and even in 2000s, even a higher number today. So, why does Reconstruction basically end and fail? One is you have corruption in the government, and this is corruption at the state and local level. The Gilded Age is the greatest period of political corruption in American history. The economy hurt Southerners with the heavy taxes, trying to pay for these infrastructure projects. Violence, so people were scared with the Ku Klux Klan. And the Democrats returned to power, and Republicans in the North basically give up on it. Okay. So you look at the successes of Reconstruction. A lot of people think that the Reconstruction is a total failure. That's not the case. Okay, you do have the 14th, 15th amendments that are passed. Southern economy changes a little bit to more industry. Unfortunately, the 14th and 15th amendments aren't really enforced everywhere, and that's why you have a need for the civil rights movement. And this is what a quote from Frederick Douglass, which is a very telling thing. I'm talking about their grim situation. And this is a really accurate political cartoon. The passing of these amendments and so forth, which way with the scale tip. And that's it.